All right, everyone. Hi, everyone, and welcome to our session on hiring key executives. This is an important topic. For startups, recruiting and hiring key executives is a massive challenge. Wrong terms can cost your startups both time and money. So in this roundtable, we're going to hear from executive recruiting leader Adam Ward, who led executive recruiting at Pinterest, who's also led recruiting at Meta and Qualcomm. We'll also hear from Varun Badhwar, who is a two-time CEO, currently CEO of Endor Labs, and who has successfully sourced and retained a lot of key talent. And then also Sierra's managing partner, Mark Fernandes, who will round out the panel, shedding some insights from the boardroom and 20 plus years of supporting founders in executive searches. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. I want to throw out the first question to you, Varun, and that is, what are some signs that you need to hire an executive leader at your startup?
Well, that's a great question. And that's usually probably the most commonly asked question of other founders to me. My personal perspective on that is, when you look at your day or week and say, what are the parts of the functions that are taking away so much of your time that you're under investing in other areas? So I'll give you an example. In sales, when I got to a point where probably 40% plus of my time was spent on kind of sales, customer engagement, thinking about hiring, I said, we're at a point where I'm under investing my time on product and other operational areas of the business. So it was time to get somebody there. I think it's too soon when you're in the experimental phases and you still don't have the archetype figured out of what your motion is for sales, or what is your marketing. Is it going to be bottoms up or tops down? Or from an engineering perspective, if you have a CTO in the company, well, what role is the CTO going to play relative to VP of engineering? I would definitely discourage hiring in the experimental phases because you're going to get it wrong. But if you figured it out and spending way too much time in a particular area of the business, it's probably time to get some help.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark, from your perspective in the boardroom, is there anything else that you see that really highlights that, you need to encourage your entrepreneurs to start thinking about hiring executive talent?
Yeah, I think about our experience together, Varun, and when, what you just said about, hey, when I've got my first 7 customers, I'm going to get my first rep. And when I got my first 3 reps, I'm going to get my VP of sales. There is a thing, which is it's too early to hire an executive. But sometimes, especially in big hires, most of the time it's always we're 6 months too late when you realize something is kind of not working, and so you kind of got to look around the corner. And for us, I think the nuanced thing that I've learned over many years of doing this is being able to look forward. Sometimes the entrepreneur or the CEO may not see it, and to be able to ask the questions, because eventually the CEO has to be the person making the decision to make a hire. Part of the job as a board member is really kind of asking the questions, which encourages CEO to think about whether they should be looking for someone sooner rather than later, right? Because most of my mistakes I've made have always been about hiring someone 6 months too late, right? And so that for us is the trick, is to be able to ask the right questions to CEO.
Yeah.
I think it's a great point, Mark, because if you think about the median search time might be 5 to 6 months to do the search. So from the moment you actually decide that you need someone, that starts a many-month clock to get that person identified, onboarded, and ramped up. And so the gap can be, sometimes, several months, even up to a year when they actually needed that person on board. The other thing we see sometimes that holds founders back is just having the difficult conversation of the person who's in the seat now, that might be the head of, and that you actually might now need a true VP, right? And so the person who maybe was your first founding engineer becomes the head of engineering, and it becomes time to go hire a CTO or a VP of engineering. Often those early team members are close network associates or people from maybe in your friends and family set, and that can be a difficult conversation to have to go layer someone. And so that often delays, that difficult conversation delays the ideal timeline to getting that executive in.
Adam, I want to go a little deeper into that and about that like preparation that you need to have as an entrepreneur once you know that you need to hire that executive. I mean, you hit on a couple of the main points, but anything else that a founder really needs to be thinking about? It can, as you mentioned, this process, especially for the right executive, can take, up to a year. So what do founders need to do, and how do they need to think through that?
Yeah. I think it probably starts with like some common mistakes that we see founders and CEOs make when they're hiring executive team. And one is that they're not doing that upfront preparation work. They often jump to talking to candidates or looking at profiles or writing a job description. And actually, those are further down the path. What we see is, the most successful ones, both like being in-house, doing this for high growth companies, but now with all the startups and early stage companies we work with now, is really investing the time up front to do two things. One is appropriately scope the role, and we can talk about that in a second. But the second part is around aligning the key stakeholders on what you're looking for. So searches often take a long time, and Varun, you're nodding, you probably know this too. When a few months in or several weeks into the search, you have to kind of reset the search because you realize yourself and your co-founder or a board member are misaligned on some key attributes. And you only find that out by talking to candidates. And when you get down, you're like, I loved her. And your co-founder's like, she's not a fit. And you're like, and then you realize like, oh, actually, we didn't do the work up front to see, hey, are we aligned on these things that we're looking for? And like that work is really, I think, important in those conversations. And often there's stakeholders, not just your co-founder, but they'd be advisors or board members and other people that are really influential in the success of this role. Getting those folks aligned up front on an objective set of things helps you move much faster and know what great looks like when you see it, when you meet candidates.
That's really helpful. And then Mark, I'm going to punt it over to you from the board's perspective there. And I know that, you work so closely with your founders. What are some of these factors to consider in defining the role and responsibility of an executive hire?
Yeah, so I would say, it comes down to what the company needs, obviously, and everything Adam said is so true. But I think the one thing I found very helpful is the scorecard, right? Because eventually, if we're not aligned on kind of, let's think about who's interviewing the candidates, right? A lot of times teams will say, and Varun, you never did this, but people be like, hey, I want my CFO to interview, the VP of products or the VP of sales. And you kind of going, what's the point, right? Besides chemistry, what's the point, right? And so one of the things I've learned over time from some of the best folks is that you got to get that alignment that Adam's talking about in terms of the scorecard, right? And eventually, when you're aligned on that scorecard, I think a lot of things fall into place. The job spec, whatever the requirements are, start falling into place then. And so from our perspective as a board member, it's making sure that, whoever, it's not just the entire process, who's going to interview them, what is the spec, but that scorecard eventually kind of takes away a lot of the subjectivity of a search. And I find that it's that work up front, besides onboarding, I think that work up front is critical because that either, if we don't get it right, it extends the search out, you don't get the right hire. We've seen this over and over again. And I think the best CEOs have that ability to kind of work with the team, work with the board to get the right scorecard. And in fact, in many ways, you almost have to impose that on the recruiter because the recruiter's job is just fill the role. And if you don't, make sure that they're following the scorecard very closely, it's really difficult.
Yeah, and Adam, from your perspective, as from being both a recruiter on in-house and a recruiter at now Growth by Design, what do you need from a founder, or what makes that executive hire, that search so much easier? Like, what are some of the things that a founder can provide to you?
Yeah, and I'll say a good recruiter should be shepherding an exec through that process too. But I think it's really around providing clarity, right? So questions that we might ask a CEO is like, what is different in 6 months with this person on board? what does a home run look like from a hire? What is he or she doing differently? And what's the company doing differently? What's different about the trajectory of the company with this person on board? We start to focus on these outcomes, right? What are the outcomes that this person is going to drive? Great. Then what are the skills and characteristics and experiences needed that would help this person be able to drive those outcomes? Okay, and you create this 2x2 matrix. So on one side is the skills and experiences needed. So they maybe need to have SaaS experience. They need to have been in a high growth environment. They need to, you can pick those. These are like the tangible things. And then on the other side is the characteristics of the person. They need, there might be things that make someone successful in your company that are aligned to your core values, your culture, but also that might be really important for the role. They need to be highly collaborative, an effective communicator, these things that are kind of clear characteristics. And then you break them up by like must-haves and nice-to-haves, right? And these must-haves are stack ranked. This is the scorecard Mark's talking about, right? And so you do this work up front of these must-haves and nice-to-haves against experiences and characteristics. And that sets up your areas of how you're going to interview, right? This creates your scorecard. This helps you assign focus areas for your interviewers, right? This helps you source and be able to communicate. Here's like who we're looking for. And so all this work really sets up the entire search process and running a really structured hiring process, which helps you give you confidence that you're hiring the right person objectively versus a lot of the biases that can creep in based off of places people have worked or maybe connections they have. You have this kind of objective scorecard before you even met candidates.
So Varun, Adam just talked about some of these characteristics for you now on your second company and having a successful exit on your first one. For early stage companies, what are the qualities that you look for? What are some of these characteristics in executives that you now know to seek out?
Yeah, I think that, Anne, is a very personal question, and I can tell you how I think about this. First and foremost, I think where mistakes are made is when you're not secure about your strengths, but also open about your weaknesses as a CEO. I think if you're not vulnerable enough about it, you will try to find somebody who's not the absolute best in the areas that you're maybe not so good at because they will look better. Their ideas will be better than you. I think you have to understand and realize that is okay. That's why you're bringing them in. The other thing, which is a personal choice for me that I've made over the years, is I've looked for in the characteristics scope that Adam was mentioning, especially in early stage. I've looked for people that are really, really hungry and want to get a shot at proving themselves out at that next level. So maybe they've been at a company, they did it, and they have regrets of how they did it, and they want to have another shot at it. Or maybe they've been one seat lower than a VP. They have learned from the best, and they're chomping at the bits to get that exposure to run worldwide sales or be head of product. And so for us, I find when you look for those people that are just really hungry to prove themselves out, given the right stage and context and opportunity, they do extremely, extremely well. Now, when you're looking at growth stages, my first choice is that these people that I've hired early on continue to grow with us, but oftentimes that may or may not happen. And at that point, when you're kind of in the later stages of growth, at that point, my personal criteria shifts a little bit to say, look, we've hit 0 to 10. Now we're looking for 10 to 100. Maybe it's wise at this point to look for somebody who's done 10 to 50 and looking for bringing in known experiences, but taking it a step further. So I think those are probably important characteristics from a prior experience perspective. I think from a culture perspective, again, there's certainly alignment on vision that is important, but I'm always looking for people that macro level align from a culture perspective, but at a micro level may have different ways of operating. And that's okay because I want the diversity of those differences in execution. So everybody's not thinking and acting like me, but is bringing in sets of ways of thinking and ideas and execution plans that may be more diverse. And I am completely open to that, but not every founder is.
So Mark, from your perspective, so Sierra, we invest in the early stage, seed and A, but when you're building these relationships with founders, it's for the long haul. And I know you personally spend a ton of time on our companies as they make it to the later stage, and you're spending time helping them recruit from at that seed stage all the way into the growth stage. So from your perspective, what are some qualities that you see in key executives that founders should be aware of in the hiring process?
Yeah, so maybe, and I'll turn your question around to kind of my framework, right? So how I think about it, because what Varun said is absolutely right. Early stage, I mean, and what you said actually holds true for how we think about entrepreneurs, right? When I met you the first time, it's like you had ringside seats to a company and you knew all the playbook and you kind of ran. But now as you look in the second company, you've got your playbooks, right? And so you know what to do. I think the same. And as I think about our framework or my framework, as I look at hiring for early stage or for later stage roles, right? My framework falls in three buckets. It's IQ, EQ, and domain, right? And you can tune it and you can fine tune it based on what the requirements of the company are. But to me, the domain is kind of table stakes to some extent, unless you're hiring someone who's, a bit of a jack of all trades, depending on the company. But that IQ and EQ part of it for me is absolutely critical, right? And that EQ kind of ties to what Varun was saying. It's the hunger, it's the chemistry with the team, all of those pieces of the puzzle. But I've learned over time to fine tune, the searches that I do with my founders to keep the same buckets, but to fine tune the characteristics in each of these buckets, right? And so if, like Varun was saying, the playbook is really important, right, then I might trade off some of the other capabilities for that playbook, right? But there are certain things you don't trade off: chemistry with the founders, things like that. But I do feel like you turn those three knobs based on the stage of the company, the founder chemistry, things like that. But I think that framework of IQ, EQ, and domain kind of have stayed the same for me across all these searches I've done.
So Adam, from your side as a recruiter, hearing from a founder kind of these quadrants that they're particularly interested in, let's go tactical. And can you share some effective interview techniques or approaches for evaluating executive candidates, for strategic thinking, for problem solving, for the IQ, EQ, and chemistry that Mark just talked about?
Yeah, and I love conjugating scorecards like Mark's into actionable assessment plans. And I think, and I say assessment broadly because just remember, we have a lot of vehicles at our disposal to get signal on a candidate. We put a lot of energy and emphasis, and rightfully so, on interviewing, but we also are going to be checking references. We're also going to be looking at experience. We're also going to be we can do work samples, we can do case studies. There's lots of things you have access to get to the right signal. So I often think about, based on the scorecard that we've built, what is the best medium for us to get the right signal for that candidate against that experience, characteristic, whatever it might be. And so it could be a one-to-one interview. It could be a working session with the product and edge teams. It could be a half day. It could be a couple of lunches and dinners with the founder to kind of get that. Do we have that relationship, and do we have that shared values? It could be selective references, and things like that. So I like to think about building an entire interview plan from the beginning that is very intentional and mapped back to the signals that we want to get. And one mistake we often see is sometimes the most vital things that really matter don't get assessed till the end. So maybe it's founder exec relationship. That, to Mark's point, that might be really critically important. Sometimes those dinners don't happen till the very end. And you realize that dinner is we're not aligned here, and we just spent dozens of hours in a process. So how can you put some of the more heavily weighted things towards the front, so you're optimizing the collective time the company and board and advisors are spending on this search?
So Varun, I guess I'll kick this over to you. I think with culture fit being so important, and as an early stage founder, you're doing interviews all the time. For these executive candidates, do you have any tricks or techniques that you used to kind of suss out if a candidate is a good culture fit for your particular startup?
Look, the thing you expect out of good candidates is, at the very least, they can sell themselves well. So I typically put 40% weightage on the direct interview conversations, 60% on blind references and conversations with people they've worked with. And so heavy emphasis on that. To Adam's point, there's a lot of other ways to suss out a person than just the 60, 90 minutes you spend with them. I'd say generally my interview questions are very broad. Like one of my favorite questions is, what's your superpower? And, it's interesting to see how people think through and respond to questions that are rather broad than, tell me a time you did X and Y and Z. But yeah, I don't think any rocket science here. You just got to spend the time digging through your network, and your recruiters have to help you on a lot of conversations with people they've worked with. And I would say on those blind reference checks, you will generally find, well, in an ideal world, you get all great thumbs up. In a lot of cases, you'll get the good and the bad, and you have to suss out off that what is important and relevant to you based on your organization, your culture. What can you live with, and what's a complete non-starter for you? And the other piece that I found is, going back to Mark's point, like sometimes for domain expertise, I won't have them talk to, like there's no reason a CPO is talking to CFO, but sometimes we will throw this off where we will have a leader talk to an individual contributor outside of their domain and just see how they're talking to the person, treating them, responding to their questions, because that tells you a lot about culture fit, right? Do they have a chip on their shoulder? Are they humble? Are they having the right attitude towards these people that may not be part of the quote unquote decision-making process in their mind, but is just an employee in the company talking to them?
And if I can add something to what Ben said, I think it's really important to define what culture is for your company. So, a lot of companies now, versus 5 years ago, are defining core values pretty early. And if you have those, that's great. And if you don't, okay. But coming up with, back to my alignment point early on, aligning with the key stakeholders on like what are actually the competencies behind the type of culture that we want, right? So if you have a core value of high horsepower, let's say that's a thing that we want high horsepower people. If we each independently wrote down and defined right now what high horsepower would be, we'd have 4 different definitions of that. So getting really clear, is high horsepower high IQ? Is it high EQ? Is it versatility? Is it structured thinking? We should really define what that is. And so when you are assessing for culture, you're doing it somewhat consistently among candidates, and you're not letting bias creep into how you might assess that person because they maybe have a similar approach that you do or background, other things. So having a really structured approach to even something as relatively soft and maybe can be squishy in companies like culture and values is really important.
So
and
Mark,
one other thing that reminded me on how we gather feedback on candidates from our stakeholders. The mistake I used to make is everybody get on a call and, okay, start with person 1, 2, 3, 4. And what I noticed is by the time you got to person 2 or 3, they were already influenced by what the first 2 folks had said. So a mandatory requirement in our interview process is everybody has to document their feedback first, and then we will have a debrief where everybody gets to see what everybody else wrote, and we have a conversation around that.
And while we're super tactical, the hiring manager goes last, right? So Varun is the hiring manager in this case. He goes last because people will even shift a little bit of what they wrote versus what they say if Varun goes first and kind of creates that lens. So it's good to have the team go first and the hiring manager go last. The hiring manager is getting as objective inputs so that they can make the right decision at the end.
Hey, can I ask a quick question? Do you, like Varun and Adam, do you ask the same questions to candidates? This is one of the things I've learned over time to prevent biases and stuff, right? Do you tend to prefer to ask the candidates the same questions, at least the same core set of questions? Have you found that to be helpful, or do you kind of wing it and ask more open-ended questions?
I kind of wing it, but thematically they're all aligned to the same areas, right? Like to your point, it's IQ, EQ, and domain. Now, how I get to that, I let it be more conversational. I don't have a list of 5 questions. I may start with a very open-ended question, and depending on that response, go down a certain path. But thematically, they will align to those 3 pillars, and the 4th one being really around culture on our side.
Yeah, and I'll just add, I think tunneling is a really important skill when it comes to interviewing. And so Mark or Verna, forget who said it, but executives are generally really, strong communicators and, can sell themselves. But tunneling is the follow-up question, where you go deep. So Varun might have a set of 4 or 5 broad questions, and he's then tailoring the follow-ups based off of what their answers are. And that's when you start to get to the core nuggets of who that person is or what experience they did. What role did they play in that? What outcome did they drive? What do they truly believe? What is their true characteristic? When you start getting tunneling in on these follow-up questions, is that real signal.
Adam, one of the things I'd love that you touched on that I'd love to go a little deeper is in this idea of, making sure that in the interview process, people aren't influenced by each other. Are there other techniques that you suggest? You mentioned about having the founder or the hiring manager go last. Anything else that a startup should be doing to ensure that, each candidate's getting kind of their fair kind of shake in the process?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I mean, one is that you do want to give a focus area to your whoever's doing that assessment. So Varun might have his focus area. Mark's focus area might be another one. And you ask people to relatively stay in their lane, right? So I think one mistake that often is unfair to interviewers is you're asking them to make a hire or no hire decision. That's actually incorrect. You're asking them to make a decision based on your area of focus. Would you support you a yes or no on your area of focus? And you might get other signals that are really important to the decision, and you should surface those. But if we think about that scorecard or all that work we do up front, you start to align these focus areas, and then this interviewer has the same focus area for every candidate. They're going to start to get calibrated themselves and get really a strong signal of what great looks like for the area of focus. And then the hiring manager takes all that input and uses that to make the best decision with that information to do. So that's one. The second is, Varun mentioned it, is requiring people to write their feedback, come into like a debrief situation. And I'd also recommend getting that feedback down within 24 hours, because think about all that happens in 24 hours from when you talk to a candidate to when you sit down to write that down. And so we get really tactical of thinking about, here's how to structure your 60 minutes with a candidate. Here's like a framework, take some notes and have that to rely on to then write that down in a more structured way before you go into a debrief. So I think that's a really important third point that I'd make on helping mitigate bias throughout the process.
And I think especially for really early stage founders and first time founders, what's important is that the people within the hiring process aren't walking in there blind, and that there are some type of questions that are put together, or people know what their area of expertise or what they should be interviewing for. Is that something, I assume at the earliest stage, it's got to be the founders, Varun, I assume, in the early stages of your company, you put that together. Any advice for how you kind of structure that, or kind of divide and conquer for as a team trying to assess out the qualifications of a candidate?
On our side, we don't make it a crowdsourced process to begin with. What I've found is the hiring manager has to begin with what are the core competencies they're looking for, the core requirements. We'll certainly open it up for input, but we won't start with at least in my organization, you won't start with a blank slate and say, everybody just crowdsource what you think this should be. I think you need to be opinionated as a hiring manager on what you need. And certainly you want to make sure you didn't miss anything that's core and critical to the requirements. But yes, it's the hiring manager's responsibility, in my opinion.
So, Mark, I'm going to go to something that's a little more tactical, because I know that you do a lot of those first calls for founders for hiring executive talent, and you've done, performed some of the searches yourself. What are some things that are huge red flags for you when you're talking to a candidate that wants to potentially be a leader at one of your startups?
Yeah. I was going to ask Varun and Adam for like the big mistakes. So think about it, guys. Where have you gone wrong? But look, the first thing for me, Anne, is someone's got to walk in prepared, right? And Varun knows exactly the example I'm talking about here. But I was interviewing a CRO candidate for one of my companies. We're sitting at a coffee shop, and the person walks in and walks past me, right? And I'm going, okay, so I'm an investor, I'm a board member, and you don't know what I look like, and you haven't looked at my LinkedIn profile, right? And so I mean, that wasn't a yellow flag, that was a red flag, and it was like, flashing red, right? So as I go down the list of things, I think the prepared mind is super important. Have they done their work on the company? Have they looked at the videos of the founders and CEOs, especially at the early stage? There's plenty of material available on LinkedIn and companies' websites. So all of that kind of falls into this. It's a combination of IQ and EQ, but really this maturity that someone's got to, they're walking into meetings prepared, right? And so if I look at kind of the biggest mistakes someone's made is they just don't come to a meeting prepared, right? And that to me is just a no-go right off the bat, right? Whether it is, preparing on the materials of the company, what their sales strategy, who's involved. And some people go down to another level of depth, which is, they scour LinkedIn and looked at who their connections are and all of that's a different level of preparation. At least the basic level of preparations kind of got to be there. So prepared mind is really, really important for me. But I'll throw it to Varun and Adam, like, you guys have recruited a lot, and what do you think the one or two big mistakes you've made, or like if you want to go through a case study, like where has it gone wrong for you?
Yeah, I think to your point, preparedness is a big signal. Like when I'm talking to people, so I'll give you an example, very tactical. We have a recorded demo on our website. If you're coming and talking to us and expressing interest, if you haven't seen the demo, that's a problem. Well, you know what's more important? If you own up and said, sorry, I didn't get time, but then you make up your way through telling me that you watched it, and I know you haven't watched it because I have lead forms coming in and I know who's registered for it. And so I think, kind of testing just your ethics here in some way, like own up. If you're not prepared, sorry, I didn't get time, but let me do a follow-up, come back to you. In terms of where it's gone wrong, I would say stage relevance is really important in early stage. Like early stage companies are chaotic, right? And the way you make decisions, the speed, the velocity of all of that kind of information gathering to dissemination to outcomes happens at a pace that is unprecedented. And I think the mistakes I've made is you find this amazing star power person at a great company you look up to, but that company is like 6 years ahead of you, 8 years ahead of you. And those people haven't been at an early stage organization. I think that's usually where I've got it wrong, is I've kind of fallen for the charisma of the person, but not really mapped to stage relevance. And the last piece is, again, going back to your kind of, just so impressed by the charisma of somebody, you get excited, but you don't do your homework on the back channel side to understand. They may be amazing, but they have certain personality traits that are just going to be contradictory and conflicting with your style of working as a founder or your team style of working. That can become very toxic very quickly.
Yeah, I think I'll add, maybe just extrapolate out. I feel like the characteristic that we find is most important for early stage founders or for early stage execs and leaders is curiosity. So it's the curiosity about the business. It's the curiosity to learn what's happening. It's asking the questions. It's doing some of that prep work, some of that engagement, but they're just insatiably curious. And I think that's a really important characteristic to have. I think it's a cousin to like hunger and drive, that chip on the shoulder that Varun was talking about that he's looking for. But that curiosity, I think, helps drive those behaviors that you're looking for. And then I'd say the most common mistake we see is that founders ignore things that they said objectively were really important to them because they do get distracted by a logo of where someone was. They give all these assumed traits and characteristics and experiences based on their perception of a company in that logo and like what that company did, even if that person didn't have a direct impact on that piece of work. So they kind of like let the perception of that company override what they actually learned about that specific person. And that's often like a big mistake. Maybe a quick story I'll tell is we had a candidate that we're interviewing for a COO role. And we, two things that we learned about this person. One was they really drive results and they came from a lot of great logos. But the other thing we learned through the references was they break glass, right? How they drive results really leaves a wake behind them. And we somewhat buried that. We as like the exec team buried that learning because we were so enamored in like thinking about what the press release will look like or how that'll land and how that'll help us attract other. We kind of like, I know you're all nodding and smiling, you know that case. And then what happens 9 months, 12 months down the road, that exec isn't working well with the other team. It's a dysfunctional exec team. And I said that was a very costly mishire, particularly in a role like a COO. So when you start to ignore those really key signals that you said objectively and independently were really important, that ends up being a really dangerous path.
So I want to jump to a question from the audience, and anyone can kind of chime in and answer this. Is it ever a good idea to hire an executive before an individual contributor, like hiring a VP of sales before hiring an AE?
I'm very passionate about this subject, and I'm very vocal about this, so I will tell you. The answer is it depends. It depends on the function. It depends on the founder. What I mean by that is if you're a highly technical engineer by background CEO, and you've got to kind of go build this B2B enterprise sales business, as soon as you at least figure out some part of your kind of ideal customer profile and your target market, probably a wise idea to maybe not go to a very high-end VP of sales, but get somebody down a head of sales or somebody who can independently build a book of business for you, hire a first few people, and then they have the opportunity to potentially grow into a VP of sales, or eventually you layer in a VP of sales. On the other hand, for me personally at Redlock, as Mark knows this, my philosophy was I knew enough sales to be dangerous, where I could run the sales organization with 3 or 4 reps. I really wanted to understand the archetype of the sales motion, the kinds of sales reps we wanted to hire. That then defined the leader, and that's how we defined the requirements for what an ideal VP of sales looked like at Redlock, and eventually hired for a great leader in that organization.
And I love the follow-up question here, Anne, that was just dropped in. So I'd love to talk about that, how we coach founders around. I'm a technical leader and I'm hiring my first marketing leader. I don't know what marketing is. I don't know. And how do I actually know what good looks like? And one tactic we love is to lean on your investors, your advisors, and your network of like, hey, who's the best marketing person you know? Can I do an informational conversation with them? And you meet 5 or 6 of them to get a sense of the flavor and seniority of different marketing leaders in this case. And you get to start to form an opinion of not only what great looks like, but what do I need in terms of level, breadth? Do I need more product marketing, or do I need more like channel marketing? The wide range of things that might be. And by the way, it could be one of those people could get really excited, right? So it's a passive way to possibly talk with candidates could be great, or to ask those people for referrals, because you might really hit it off with that person. And now that's just extended your network quite a bit into like the world of marketing. So that's a tactic we like early on to really scope what does great look like when you're hiring out some expertise, which is going to happen pretty quickly.
Yeah. Thank you, Adam. It's at the end of the day, if I look at my calendar, right? And I think about, you talked about leaning on your investors or board members. If I look at my calendar for existing portfolio companies, I separate out into looking for new deals and helping our existing portfolio. I'm going to say a third of my time, maybe sometimes even up to half, is gone with helping my founders recruit, right? And that at the end of the day is the only way we scale as an investor, as a venture capitalist, because it comes down to, if I've got 8 to 10 portfolio companies, that's the real leverage at the end of the day, right? And so from my perspective, that is time well spent, because that helps your founders scale and grow and give them time to do what they do best, right? So maybe I'll ask Varun this question, right? Varun, how much of your time is spent recruiting? Right? There's recruiting and managing, but how much of your time is spent recruiting? And I'm sure it's different at different stages of the company, but you probably think very actively about how much time you spend. And you're a different league of founder, but there are a lot of founders who've never been down this path before. And so if talk about yourself, and then talk about when Varun 10 years ago, when you were getting going, how would that look different for a founder? How much time should they be spending on recruiting?
And Mark, it also depends not just on your experience, but also stage of the company. I mean, both with Rudlock, but also with Endor Labs. The first year of the company, I was spending 70% of my time probably recruiting. I was recruiting every engineer in the company. I was recruiting every marketeer in the company, salesperson. You have to do it. Your brand isn't recognized. Nobody, like, you're selling a vision, and the best person in the company who can sell a vision and a dream is you, the founder. And so that's where I spend that time. I would say today, it kind of goes in cycles, because we hired almost 50 people in the company in the first 12 months, and then we kind of tapered off, and now we're picking back up. I'm back in the 25%, 30% of my time being in various parts of either recruiting or recruiting diagnosis with my team, or recruiting planning and strategy and related elements. So I think as a high growth company, it's going to be a good amount of your time. And yes, you can get people to help you on operations, but you're still, I mean, we have a reasonably good brand 20 months later, but it's still early, right? And everybody wants to hear from me. Why should they leave their cushy situation and come work here? We recently completed a VP of product search. When we were in the midst of that search, that was probably taking up half my time in working with our executive recruiting partners and building everything we've discussed, start to finish, right? The planning, the alignment with the teams, the feedback, the debriefs, the offer stages. The one piece I just want to go back to on if you're hiring outside of your core expertise question, the thing that I did that was relatively successful for me was also building an advisory board, because what Adam said is important. Go have those 5 conversations up front. But remember, it's not just hiring this person. Eventually, you have to manage this person. And eventually, you have to understand how to be a successful manager to this person, align on metrics, OKRs, make sure they're doing reasonably well. Like, are they selling you smoke and mirrors on their performance, or can you actually evaluate how well they're doing? You will require sustained support and advisors. And so beyond the board, look for building an advisory board in areas of your weakness as a founder.
So we've got a question that I'm going to send over to Mark on this one that came through. So executive recruiters are pricey, especially for the best. Mark, how do you think about that with your founders and with your portfolio? Do you like them to use executive recruiters? Do you want them to try to figure it out themselves first? What's your process when you make recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's the balance of, spending the money on a search or my CEO's time, right? And that eventually you can put a price on your CEO's time. And, if you end up spending $75,000 or $80,000 on a VP of marketing search, you have to go, does my CEO have a network of people that they can go pull from? I mean, Varun, now where you are in your journey, you probably know a whole bunch of people that you can go out and ping to fill up a VP of marketing search. 10 years ago, probably not, right? And so it's that fine balance that you figure out what is the alternative use of time and what is the network that you have at the end of the day. And to me, if you are hiring at a C-level, most of the time I find that it's a really good use of time and money if you've got the right recruiter, the right network. But sometimes you let the CEO go, hey, give yourself a month to see if there's someone in the network. But Varun, maybe you have some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, I think, look, every executive we've hired here, except the VP of product, we hired ourselves. But we were very clear on the VP of product search. We did exactly what you said, Mark. We looked at our network, but here was a problem. One of the key requirements we had is that we don't want somebody who thinks and acts like us as another security domain person. We want somebody with dev tools background as well. In our network, we could in our sleep find somebody with just, pure play security background. So we said, let's expand this to an executive recruiter who's really good at their craft in this domain, and let's explore it. And at the end of the day, you have to look at what what the impact of a wrong hire is. To Adam's point, like, you get a wrong executive hire decision, you've lost 9 months of your company, but you've also paid them 9 months of your salary. An executive recruiter is probably cheaper than that, a lot cheaper. So it's how you kind of look at this in perspective.
So Adam, coming now, you probably worked with a lot of recruiters when you were at Pinterest and Meta and Qualcomm, and now being on the other side and Growth by Design being like the premier everyone that I talked to when I had this original question was like, you got to go talk to Adam. So, but with that, like, I know a lot of what you guys do is later stage as well, but you do early stage. And for early stage, is there too early to be working with a recruiter, or do you need to focus more on some of the stuff we've been talking about? What do they need to be? How do they need to be prepared before they go work with an external recruiter?
Yeah, I mean, I think we generally prefer to work in earlier stages. We like to hire the first ones. It's fun. I think that's more fun than like the change management exercise of like replacing an exec. But I think there's this like self-assessment of like, do I have the time? Do I have the expertise? Are we good at this? And do we have the network to go hire? And if you do decide to go to a search firm, I think you want to be you want to be talking with several of them, right? First of all, you want to be understanding, have they done these searches before? What is their network? What is their process? I think when I was in house, we didn't enjoy working with search firms, and that's kind of part of our motivation to build the firm we did. Is like it wasn't a very good experience, and we didn't really feel like we had aligned incentives with them. And so I think you want to learn about what their approach is. Are they bringing 10 profiles to that first meeting? I think that's a mistake. I think that's a flag. I think they should be really scoping it out first. But everyone has a different approach and a different ethos, and so I think you really want to learn, what their approach, what's unique about their approach, what's unique about their network, and similar to how you might think about hiring executives. So we have aligned values on these things. They are going to be a filter for you, right? They are out there representing you on the market. So you have to feel confident and comfortable that they're aligned with you, that they're going to attract the type of people, that they're the people in the network that are going to be successful in your company. They're this tip of the spear for you. I think it's really important that you feel that you're on the same side of the table with them, and they're almost an extension of your in-house team than this outside third-party firm, because I feel like that's a different type of relationship with you.
Absolutely. Okay, as we're about to wind down, there is one more question I definitely want to ask you guys, because it's something I think is really important. The idea of reference checks. So reference checks have always been kind of funny to me, because everyone gives their, the people that like them the best that they've worked with. How do you guys approach reference checks and back channeling in general? Adam, I'm going to start with you, and then Varun, I'd love to kick it over to you as to how you think about background checks or reference checks and back channeling with candidates.
Yeah, I think first you have to be intentional. I think the worst reference check is like the open-ended reference check. Like, is this person good? I think that's not helpful. So I think you want to be intentional on who you're getting references from, both like back channel and from the candidate. So I think you want to be, you're looking for a peer, you're looking for their former CEO, you're looking for someone who worked for them. So you want to get like this 360 view on them. And then based on that, you want to ask very specific reference questions that person would have purview into. So let's think about here. What's it like to work with this person? What part of the project did they work on? What did you work on? So think about like that relationship. And you want to ask very specific targeted things that are either they would have a unique exposure to, and or open gaps or flags that you picked up through your process to date. So this helps you kind of really get that first person experience to kind of close those gaps on things that you have concerns about or are just unknowns for you. And who would be the best person that would be able to close that gap? Go find that person, right? So why did they leave the last company? Go find the person who would know. Like, do the work on it to go get that and close that out for you. And so I think you just have to be very intentional about it, and in a way that helps you get the full picture, and then weigh all that accordingly with all the other signals you got. A big challenge we see is recency bias of how you weigh in referrals and back channels against the 20 hours of conversations you've already had. Are you putting that all back into the scorecard and helping you make a decision? Or are you putting 75% weightage on one person's back channel on another person at the very end of the process? So I think you just have to weight it accordingly.
Varun, anything to add to that?
No, I think Adam covered it. I haven't figured out how to quite crack the nut on the references provided by candidates to ask the specific pointed questions. Like, if I look back, how many times have we ended up with a no hire or a strong hire decision based on a reference provided by the candidate? I'd say in most cases, that reference will just solidify what we already know for the most part. But we've got a lot of polarizing views collectively, not from one person, but multiple people back channeling. So, given my personal experience, I just put more weightage on back channels. But to Adam's point, like the thing you have to be really careful of, maybe this person was just, the person you're interviewing was a driver, was hardworking, and somebody you're talking as a back channel just didn't like their style because they rocked the boat too much. That doesn't mean this is a bad person. So you have to take in context the feedback ultimately for what you're looking for, and not be completely like swayed by one person, but eventually what are the signals and tea leaves you're reading from multiple back channels.
In fact, like that could be great leadership, right? That you had to make tough calls, and not everyone's gonna be good with. I've yet to back channel an exec and get 100% amazing back channels. Like that actually is concerning to me. That means they're not actually making tough decisions or leading through challenging times. So I think you have to kind of just look at the whole picture, to Varun's point.
Interesting. That's great advice. So just wrapping up, thank you, Adam, Varun, and Mark, for your time. Adam, first off, like, how can people get a hold of you or connect with you in Growth by Design?
Yeah, LinkedIn's great. Our website is also gbdtalent.com, Growth by Design. But yeah, happy to connect with any of you if we can be helpful or give advice. Love just helping founders think through problems too. So happy to chat.
And Varun, for Endor Labs, how can people connect and kind of follow the journey of what you guys are building?
LinkedIn. I mean, that's the universal way these days. Happy to connect with folks personally, but also follow Endor Labs page on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for joining us. And of course, you can follow us for, I know this was a closed session for our portfolio, but we're going to open it up and share it publicly. So you can follow us at Sierra Ventures on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. And thank you all for taking the time, and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks for having us.